All right. Sio Nagad, Aduhin Dawadon, Galielig, G. Doha. My name is Wyman Kirk, and I am very glad that everybody is here. Welcome to our Cherokee Talks here at the Durban Feeling Language Center. We have our first speaker who will be coming up to talk about his book. His name is Oscar Hokeah. The title of the talk is Calling for a Blanket Dance. Oscar is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. He also works for Cherokee Nation in our Indian Child Welfare Office and has worked for the tribe for 8 years. This is his first novel that he's written, is Calling for a Blanket Dance. It was a winner of the 2023 PEN Hemingway Award for debut fiction. Hokeah has written for Poets and Writers, Literary Hub, World Literature Today, American Short Fiction, and elsewhere. He holds an MA in English from the University of Oklahoma with a concentration in Native American literature. He also holds a BFA in creative writing from the Institute of American Indian Arts with a minor in indigenous liberal studies. So I'd like y'all to welcome Mr. Oscar Hokeah to the stage for his talk.
Hello, hello. Is the mic on? Am I good? Hello, everybody. Theo, how y'all doing? Good to see you. Good to be here. Super excited. Oh, here we go. Now we're on. Now we're rocking. Um, Very excited that I got to do Cherokee Talks. I'd like to thank Roy Boney Jr. for reaching out to me and inviting me, and all the organizers who organized this Cherokee Talks events that are going to happen today and tomorrow as well, with some great speakers on some great topics. So I'm excited to attend those events as well. And so what I want to do today is I'm going to talk about my debut novel, So Calling for a Blanket Dance. And I'm going to read a couple of sections in it, and then I'll talk about my connection to the novel and then my process for writing and how I kind of draw from my personal life. It's not, I mean, it's definitely not memoir for sure, but people call it like an autobiographical fiction. A lot of people will call it that. But I draw from personal experiences, but also experiences from friends and family um, around me that I grew up with as well. So it's Cherokee, parts of it are Cherokee centric. It also takes place in Kiowa communities, Kiowa Comanche community on the Southern Plains. Um, so it does this movement between Tahlequah and Lawton, Oklahoma. So some of the chapters in the novel are very Cherokee centric, very Tahlequah focused, and those are the sections I'm going to read with you today. But I'm very grateful y'all came out to listen to me talk today about the book. I know there's a lot of events going on this weekend and a lot of fun things happening. Yesterday, I took my youngest daughter down to the one fire field. And she got on the jumpy houses and rode the ponies. She was super excited about the ponies. And then my 14-year-old daughter, was marching for Stillwell High School band at the parade this morning. So I was down there this morning trying to take video and photos of her, and then came up here after all that was done. So I know we're all juggling a bunch of different wonderful events this weekend, and I'm grateful that you came out to mine today. Um, so to start us off, I'm going to talk about the first chapter, the first character that shows up for us. And so just to give you a sense of the structure of the novel, every chapter is narrated by a different family member. So the main character, his name is Ever Gimasaddle, and so the novel starts out with Grandma. She narrates the first chapter, then Grandpa, aunts, uncles, cousins, siblings, until we get to the last chapter, and then that's when Ever Gimasaddle speaks for himself. So the first character that comes um, into the novel, her name is Lena Stop, and so she is kind of loosely based off of two of my grandmothers. So my grandmother was Josie Stop. I'm a Stop on my Cherokee side, and so Lena Stop is a combination of my grandmother Josie Stop and her sister Leanna Shade. So they lived together in their elder years, and I grew up in a house with them. So my household was my mom. I had two sisters, and two grandmothers. And so I was the only boy in the household. So what I do is and you'll see as I'm reading from the book, as I draw from these experiences from these individuals, and so they're loosely based on it. It's definitely fiction, but I'm going to read a little bit from Lena Stopp's section, so that you can get a sense of the trajectory of the novel, the trajectory of the main character, Everett Guinesaddle, and kind of what he has to face as he's going throughout his life. So it spans, 3 decades. So it's a multi-generational novel. So you hear from different generations throughout, and that's what's called polyvocal. With the different narrators within it. So And so when we start the novel, it starts off kind of intense, like in an intense way, where the main character, his Everett Guinesaddle's father is from Mexico, and his mother is from up here in Oklahoma, half Kiowa, half Cherokee. And so that reflects directly from my personal life. My father is from Aldama, Chihuahua, Mexico. My mom is Kiowa and Cherokee. And so I drew from that, with the main characters as well. So they take a trip to Mexico. There's a violent interaction on the way back after visiting family with the local police, and his father is beaten. So it starts off in a kind of an intense way, and I do that purposefully so that we can get a sense of the trauma that this character is kind of dealing with, even whenever he's an infant. Um, so so he's 6 months old, ever 6 months old when we first start the book, and then we see how he grows up and the different obstacles he faces, and so this violent act is kind of that initial trauma that kind of sets him on a trajectory that his grandmother Lena, she's worried about him. She's worried about what's going to happen to him as he grows up. Um, and so I'll just give you a little snippet, just like a couple of minutes of Lena Stop, talking about her grandson and her daughter. So the characters that'll be in this are going to be his mother, Turtle Guinesaddle, his father, Eduardo, and then the main character, Everett, as well. Turtle called me in the middle of the night. She was at a hospital in Presidio, Texas. Worse still, Eduardo was nearly beaten to death. First thing I asked about was Everett. Was he okay? How was he doing? Did he see what happened to his daddy? Next thing you know, Turtle barked at me. Lena, save your superstitions for another day. Mostly she was upset because her husband was hospitalized. Here all they had been stolen: car, money, clothes, and most important, my grandson's soul. But Turtle didn't have the patience to hear the last one. I wired Turtle money and said I'd drive down. I wanted to tell her I only send money if you come back with me to Tahlequah. But instead I said, don't try to leave before I get there. I also wanted to tell her you should have known better, meaning to go to Mexico. It wasn't America. It wasn't safe. I didn't say that either. I held my lectures until much later, until I had them in my car, where Turtle couldn't hang up on me or walk away. The first thing I told my daughter was, you never take it, an infant, around violence. And she tried to argue with me because by her take, Ever was only 6 months old and would never remember the incident. If she moved to Tahlequah, I could teach her how energy easily imprinted on the water molecules of the Usti. Babies should be laughing and loved on, not watching their fathers being beaten to near death. Turtle called my fears superstitious mumbo jumbo, but it didn't stop me from telling her that Ever would need to be cured by a medicine man. When Turtle laughed, I could tell she wanted me to be offended. Then afterward, she suddenly fell dead silent. I saw the concern grow on her face. The last thing either of us wanted was for our precious Usti to be forever witched. Lawton was the last place I wanted to go, or wanted my daughter and grandson to go. I wanted to stay on I 44 and continue north to Oklahoma City. Then I'd turn east along I 40 so I could eventually turn north again and follow Highway 69 through Muskogee. Then we would have been safely inside Tahlequah, my hometown. But Turtle jumped into the driver's seat when we stopped for gas in Wichita Falls. She said, I'll drive the last hour to Lawton. She knew me better than most. Surely I wouldn't kidnap my daughter and her family. Here I was offended she thought I'd try. Maybe she half expected me to make the threat, and I'd be lying if I hadn't considered it. But I took the opportunity to refresh her memory about dirty old Lawton. It was as Gadahi as exhaust shooting out of a tailpipe, and no one cared enough to clean it. A dozen Lawtons could fit inside Oklahoma City, but it had more violent crimes. The gangs and the drugs were out of control. I hated to say it, but it was a poor town, a rat's nest, if you asked me. Fort Sill barely kept the city alive. Turtle's only reason to stay in Lawton was her daddy Vincent, who barely took care of himself. Vincent lived off of land lease money and Social Security. He spent more on liquor than on his own family. And now she had a husband who lay in the back seat of my car like a sick dog. How was she going to survive? Ever had been through enough already. He didn't need to be exposed to more. Better yet, I could I could call on a medicine man to have ever cured. So I'm gonna stop right there. Um, so yeah, Lena, Lena is concerned about his future, and she's traditional, and so she has certain ways that she believes will help kind of fix the issue of him being exposed to violence at such a young age. And so whenever a lot of times the natives will say the term witch, we'll use it like if somebody's doing like bad medicine on somebody. Oh, is it? Uh oh. Sorry about that. Oh, okay. Sorry about that. I guess. Is it on? Am I good? I'm good now. I guess I'm moving around too much. My ponytail. All right. That's better. All right. Were you able to hear that? The story? Okay, my voice was all right. All right, good. Well, that works. Um, uh, sorry about that. But yeah, no. Lena is concerned about his future. She wants to take him to a medicine man as an infant and cure him. So whenever we use the term witched, a lot of times we'll, like I have mentioned, but use it in terms of someone doing bad medicine, but also if someone experiences something traumatic, like something that jars them, in a traumatic way, we'll also use that term. Oh, they were witched because they were negatively impacted, and so we might have to go visit a medicine man, and get rebalanced and get some of the negativity that's happened off of them. Um, and so there might be certain kind of rituals and customs you might have to go through for a week, 2 weeks, whatever it might be. Um, so that's what she's thinking. That's her way of thinking of that particular situation. And so she lives in Tahlequah. Her daughters were raised in Lawton, and so she lived in Lawton for a long time, and then she moved back. And so she's trying to get her daughter to move to Lawton so that she can raise her grandkids there, as opposed to staying with her grandfather. Um, so that's kind of part of the balance that's happening there, is that she's trying to get her family to move back to Tahlequah with her, but she has two daughters that are living that way. Um, so so there we get to see the initial impact of violence on Evergy Masato's life, and how that's playing out at 6 months old. Um, I'm gonna I'm gonna jump forward a little bit and get to a point where Evergy Masato's in his um, he's about 20 years old, maybe 21, his early 20s, and he's becoming independent in a lot of the similar ways that in this initial chapter, um, Turtle is becoming independent. Like, I'm not going to do what my parents want me to do. She's young. She's got a new child. She's going to try to make her own path. And Turtle Gimasaddle is in that same situation in this next chapter. I'm going to read. And so with that initial scene, that scene that happens right before we hear from Lena with the violent act that happens in Mexico. So the reason, one, I definitely strategically put it there so that we can see that trauma, but also that comes directly out of my life. And so this is one of the aspects, or one of the ways in which I write, where I'll have a memory myself of whenever I was younger. So in the book, Ever 6 months old, for me it happened whenever I was, I don't know, I may have been around 2 years old. It's one of my first memories. But similar situation. We go down to Mexico to visit family. On the way back, we're stopped by the police on the Mexico side of the border. There's a situation that happens that where my mother and father are extorted for their items, and that's where that comes in the book. They're extorted, and but in the real life situation, it wasn't my dad who was attacked. Ultimately, the victim was my mother. Um, but I drew from that experience. And so when you read that particular scene, um, that happens where the violent act actually happens, what I do is I channel um, my emotions from that memory of being 2 years old, seeing all these things happen and having no control. So that's the similar situation that Turtle Saddle is in whenever she's watching her husband being beaten. Like she's fearful. And that's what I remember, being afraid for my parents, not understanding what's going on, but emotionally, it was very impactful. So impactful that I would keep bringing it up throughout my life. And my mom would tell me to, like I'd ask her about it because I was a little kid, and I would say, "Well, I remember that time we were in Mexico, and then we stopped by the police, and she would stop talking about that. I don't want to talk about that. Like 5, 6, 7. I would keep bringing it up, and then it wasn't until I'm like a teenager, whenever I'm remembering it, vividly, and then it snaps like, oh, okay, that's why she doesn't want to talk about it. And then so I just don't bring it up again. But that's one of the methods that I use in order to bring an emotional experience for the reader. Is I'm going to take something that emotionally happened to me. It might not be the exact same circumstance we see in the book. In the book, it's very fictionalized, but the emotion is what I transfer into the book, so that the reader can connect in that way. So let me jump to um, a chapter by Turtle Gimasaddle. So Turtle Gimasaddle is Turtle Gimasaddle is, Ever's mother, and we get to hear from her in the middle of the book, directly from her, about her son. And in this particular chapter, she's talking about her son and her daughter, who goes by the name Sissy. So Turtle Gimasaddle is based off of my mom, and my mom is super quiet. And I don't know if you might have family members who are similar to this. I'm similar in a lot of ways. I'm very similar to my mother. People tell me that all the time. But my mom is super quiet, very to herself. She's usually making quilts and crocheting. She might not say 10 words in an entire day. And if I could get away with it, I probably wouldn't say 10 words in an entire day too. But in a different way, I'm at a computer and I'm like, writing on a book or reading a book, but I'm very quiet in a similar kind of way. Um, and so Turtle Gimasato was I was able to channel my mother and her perspective, um, but also that the challenge of capturing a character like that is not easy. So it's easier to capture a character who's like wants something, like I want this thing, and nothing's gonna stop me, because they have such a bigger spirit that they're easier to capture on the page. But a character who doesn't speak much, she is much harder to capture, and so you have to find nuanced ways. And well, how is she gonna tell a story if she doesn't talk? Like if she doesn't like talking, how do I do that? So what I did is, her particular chapter is she's writing it down on paper towels. Um, so she does this thing where every birthday she's well, I guess for the latter years, whenever her kids were growing up, she would take the day by herself, go for a drive, and then she would write out, like she would write that day, like a journal type of thing. um, but on this particular day, um, she is in her she is in her car and she doesn't have paper. So she finds an old paper towels in the back seat. So she gets out the paper towels and she starts writing on it. And using that method not only captures her, how quiet she is, but it also captures her desperation that happens in this particular story, in this particular chapter. And you'll get a sense of that as I read it. Um, I've not read this story for an audience before. I definitely wanted to do it today because it's very Tahlequah centric. It's very much this part of Oklahoma, um, and um, and so I thought that was an important element to bring to today's events. But also that, like, where I drew that particular element from my mother as well, because she did the same thing. When it was her birthday, like especially when I was a teenager, she like, I just want to be by myself and go do my own thing, because she's a quiet person, and so she would go on these long drives. And so I drew that from personal experience, put it in the book. But also, um, when I was probably around 14, 15, this is shortly after, you know, um, we go from, my father was abusive. We ended up in a women's shelter here in Tahlequah. That's in the book as well. And then after we were in the women's shelter, we moved to what was then called Cherokee Village, and then it became Sheridan Heights. But I don't know what it's called now. But it's a group of apartments, low rent apartments. Um, I mean, I guess it's south of here. It's at the stop. You know where the circle thing is at. There's some apartments to your left that way, and so we moved there after the women's shelter, and my mother was going through like really bad depression, and at the time I was probably like 13 years old, 14, and I didn't understand what, because she doesn't verbalize anything. So a lot of my life was trying to interpret what my mother was going through, because she would never tell me. And but there was a time period where she had, I guess she was in a bad place, but she started writing on the napkins on the table, and I found them. And so to read that, to read that kind of depression that's going through your mother when you're 13 years old, and just really not having much information to, at like no, long depth conversations with her at any point, and then this is what you have to engage with. But it was a very emotional experience for me as well. So on one part, it helps me cope with that, to write about it, but at the same time, that emotion that I have, I transferred into the book, and the reader gets to experience that as well. So, all right, so let's hear from Turtle Saddle. So this is in 1995, and Ever is around 21, and his sister around 20, and his sister's about 16 years old. So Turtle Saddle, 1995. Near 6 months ago, maybe seven, I stopped at the video section in a research grocery store and searched rows of movies where I spied a pen on the edge of a narrow shelf. Its silver lettering, Perry's Pest Control, 918-555-0183, the Critter Getter of Tahlequah, Oklahoma. And the large round size of the pen's body grabbed my attention, more the matte silver clasp and tip and clicker too. The body was earthy brown, near copper, I'd say. I picked up both the pen and the movie behind it, Dance Me Outside. At home, I slid the movie into my VCR, made a picture of that too sweet tea, and fell into my recliner. Sissy walked into the house a little too chipper. What's Turtle watching today? She asked, like I was one of her bubbly little friends instead of her mother. She plopped onto the couch, and I didn't bother to turn around because I was reading the names off the opening credits. The phone rang across the room, forcing Sissy to hop from the couch. She snatched the phone off the wall, pulled the cord to one side. Tank? She asked. I'm not sure why she called him that. Come to find out, his name was Toby. Then she paused and said, No, I don't speak Spanish. She listened until the person finished speaking, and then, rudely, she hung up the phone. The word Spanish made me think of my husband, and I wanted to ask if it was him. Instead, I kept watching Dance Me Outside. Ever came home 40 or 45 minutes later. The movie was not over yet, and it was starting to get good. Sissy told Ever she got a phone call about their father, my Eduardo, and I couldn't believe my ears when she said he had passed away. I quickly glanced from the movie and at my children. Ever shrugged his shoulders and lifted his brow, the same way his father lifted his brow. He said that he had gotten a job at Greenleaf Nursery, a 300-acre nursery outside of Tahlequah, across the highway from Lake Tenkiller, tucked away deep in the Ozark Hills. Sissy took this moment to announce that she was 4 months pregnant. The news of my daughter's pregnancy unnerved me, more so than their father's death. Maybe less so, but too much news made me shake. Things always happened in threes, and suddenly it was like being pulled into three different directions. I was overwhelmed. So I pushed the stop button on the VCR and went into my room, where I took the Critter Getter pen out of my back pocket and placed it on the dresser. I spent most days printing labels in the medical records department in the back room of W. Hastings Indian Hospital, then pasting those labels into countless files on countless people living inside and outside of Tahlequah, mostly Cherokees, but other tribes too, like Creeks and Seminoles, or mixed tribes like myself, half Kiowa and half Cherokee. It's not uncommon too for people in this part of Oklahoma to be mixed with white and black, and occasionally, like my children, half Mexican. Eduardo had been a seasonal farm worker from Chihuahua until we married, and he stayed in Oklahoma until he changed and went back. That week, I crossed my daughter's file, Yolanda Chavez, date of birth 7/15/1979, only 16 years old, and she had her first prenatal appointment. I pasted the label for the day of the appointment onto her appointment sheet and slid the file back onto the shelf with the thousands of others. I was going to be a grandmother before my 40th birthday. Today, I turned 40. Sitting in my car, I write today as I have on every birthday. But I don't have sheet paper, but I found a roll of paper towels in the back seat of my car. The disappointment of Sissy, pregnant at 16, held my tongue to the roof of my mouth, so we did not talk. Days later, it was my daughter who made the first comment. She said that pen was ugly and reminded her of a rolled turtle spread across a country road. I hardly noticed the scratches on the pen's side, and if I had been talking to her, I would have told her it was my pen, so she didn't need an opinion. Maybe this was what she wanted, since there were moments in the evenings before bed when she would ask me if she should be showing more or if her stretch marks would go away. Why did the nausea stop and the heartburn start? She asked. Will my hips get too wide? Why are my breasts so tender? Her body changed with the summer heat until both were unbearable. She asked if I wanted to feel the baby move or see her belly button sticking out, but I pour myself a glass of tea and go into my room. At times, a sob slipped from under her breath, and other times, a sigh escaped from her gritted teeth. Either way, I'd leave my daughter to sit by the phone and wait for this tank person to not call because he never did. Well, maybe not never, but almost never. If you ask me, it might as well have been never. In the evenings, I watched my shows on television. Everett would walk through the front door around 5:30. He always took a nap for an hour or so. Working under the sun cooked him into submission. It broiled him from a light colored skin to an earthy copper to a dark brown. He had little energy until after his nap and dinner. Like Sissy, he had only ugly words for my favorite pen. Said, "You're going to be one of those hoarders in your old age. Get rid of it already." Nonsense to my ears as far as I was concerned, seeing that he had no use for a pen like mine anyhow, seeing how he cared more for violence than anything else. He works at Greenleaf Nursery. His work at Greenleaf Nursery led him to a Cherokee man, Half Creek. My son liked to call him Boo Right. At first, I thought he said bull rights, near appropriate, but from what I understood, Boo Right was some kind of a playful variation of Barnett, the man's last name. I'm not sure how my son came up with that one. Anyway, Ever liked Boo Wright, even though he was 20 years older. By my estimation, he was the kind to drive over to Arkansas, get himself a tattoo, and come back strutting around like a chicken dancer at contests. Turned out Boo Wright was an ex con who charmed my son with comments like, "I get the urge to attack people. Sometimes you just have to fight." And my knuckles are begging for a brawl. Ever's father had often used similar words. It seemed the older Ever grew, the more aggressive he became, and maybe he'd end up like so many other men, like Boo Wright. The two would drive around the 300 acres of Greenleaf Nursery on something called a wing ding and pulled orders, picking up plants, half-gallon buckets of flowers to 15-gallon buckets with trees. Ever routinely tried to outlift Boo Wright with the heavier plants, so his muscles always ached. He wore a back brace, gloves, and goggles, a face mask for areas with chemical spray. He'd come home for dinner, take a nap, and then shower before he left to go hang out with his friends. I would keep watching my shows. Sometimes I had to turn the television up because I could not stand to hear my daughter on the telephone chatting away with this tank person, or more likely chatting to her friends about this tank person. It was more than near begging from her when he refused to come to the house and visit, when she believed his lies about the reasons. It made me ashamed because her father had told me similar lies and empty promises. I almost said something when this tank told her that he had a surprise for her birthday, but my tongue stayed against the roof of my mouth. She was excited enough to almost hug me. He would be by the house and spend the entire day with her, supposedly. The surprise, unfortunately for her, was that her birthday came and went without any word until later in the evening when he called to tell her that he was having car trouble. Her eyes were red from crying, bags under those eyes, tissue littered her room. She told him, "It's okay," holding her hand to her chest, clenching her shirt, pressing her fist, adding, "I understand." I wanted to snatch the phone and yell into the receiver, "You are worthless," and hang up, and then yell at my daughter, "Forget about him," and hold her, saying, "You're too good and too beautiful." Instead, I turned up the television when she laughed at one of his jokes and chatted with him as if he had done nothing at all. On my lunches at work, I would go down to the basement floor of the Indian hospital and sit outside on a patio at the only table. I always drank exactly one can of Pepsi and thought about my son. In the mornings, he made 6 sandwiches, 3 for himself, 3 for his friend. He packed 2 bottles of Diet Mountain Dew so he could share his lunch and sit in his car in the broiling afternoon sun with Mr. Bootwright. When news broke about the Oklahoma City bombing, he and Bootwright were eating lunch. Initially, he thought the announcer was lying to impress the audience, mistaking the announcer's nervous pitch as fake. "Cheap guy," my son said. It was too far fetched to believe, so he said back to the radio, "You don't have to lie." Like it was the World of the World's radio show that had tricked people into believing the planet was being invaded by aliens. This time, there was no trickery. Oklahoma City had been bombed. I heard of the bombing later on the evening news after work. I never understood the rage coming from men, and likely never will, or how men abused men and then called children collateral damage. There were times when I would think of him at his lunch while on my own until I finished my can of Pepsi and went back upstairs to the medical records department so that I could type and paste labels for the files. Toward the end of summer, when Sissy was 7 months along, she began to talk in detail about everything, even though I didn't respond. She told me how Tank owned a brand new truck, had his own apartment at 17, and would inherit his father's auto body shop. I cared little about how Tank led stomp dances and had the best turkey call east of the Ozark timberline, or how he had his own stickball team. I certainly didn't want to hear about him playing basketball for the University of Oklahoma with a full scholarship. What I wanted to know was why he never introduced himself to me and why he never came around to see my daughter now that her stomach was bigger than the water tower on the Sequoia High School grounds. Mostly, I wanted to know why my daughter let someone lie to her so often. I wanted to know so much. My tongue was trapped behind my teeth and stuck to the roof of my mouth. When my son spoke about Bootwright, it often had something to do with his time he spent in the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. Bootwright spent exactly 11 years, 9 months, and 3 days incarcerated. My son learned all kinds of criminal behavior from this new friend. So I tuned my son out when he mentioned how this Mr. Bootwright knew how to cook meth. All this, even though Bootwright had nearly exploded his own heart from an addiction to that stuff. I hated to hear about those awful acts. I watched my shows instead of listening to the fact that Bootwright, who must have been in his late 30s, nearly my own age, liked to fight teenage gang members in Stillwell after spending half the night in bars with women that my son described as that 2 a.m. Come to find out, Bootwright had invited him to do a little boxing in his backyard, and I wanted to say, "You need to stay home," but ever explained that he could take this new friend and laughed. I was less than half his size, and he was more than twice as mean. It was hard for me to stop his aggression. I did my best to dream of ways to keep him home, to somehow force him to stay. When that didn't work, all I had in me was to hope he'd return. So instead of saying, "It's safest at home," I watched my shows. He did return home later that night with the left side of his face bruising from brow to chin by the following morning. The first words I finally said to my daughter in over 3 months were, "Hurry up and get in the car." She walked into the house one evening with her hands pressed to the underside of her massive belly, tears falling out of her eyes and choking back sobs. She drove an hour-long trip with contractions, nearly driving off the road several times, crying uncontrollably against her pain, more the pain in her heart rather than the pain in her stomach. The doctors in the emergency room at the Indian hospital often treated people as though they were files to be read, labeled, and put back on a shelf. This doctor was rude, distracted, callous, and he stared at my daughter's file instead of her face. He gave her medication to slow the contractions and steroids for the baby inside her so that its lungs would grow faster. My daughter's body was trying to go into premature labor at 7 months, and her baby didn't have lungs. Regardless of his uncaring nature, Sissy was thankful the callous doctor was able to slow her contractions. She lay in a hospital bed, the gown tied over her high stomach, as I sat in a worn out chair. And she said that she had gone to the stomp grounds that evening. She had not heard from her tank in over 2 weeks. She found his friends at the stomp that night, but not him. One of his friends explained that Tank had not been coming to the stomps for the past 2 months. He spent all his time with a girl whom my daughter knew well enough to call a friend, who also knew that my daughter was pregnant. They told us my daughter could go into labor at any moment. 2 weeks later, she did. This was as momentous as when my son returned home from work a few days after his nephew was born and said, "I'm going to join the army." He went on to explain that Bootwright had arrived at work that morning drunk from the night before, and he nearly crashed the wingding into a greenhouse, once almost driving off the side of a hill. His friend called him a bitch the entire morning. His friend threatened to bruise up the other side of his face and repeatedly taunted him with the word squawnee and told him that he wasn't a real Cherokee because he was half Mexican. Bootwright went on a lunch break and never came back. Everett was then responsible for pulling orders by himself for the rest of the day, which meant loading and unloading all the plants, tagging and organizing plants by docks and trucks, driving and searching hundreds of acres for special orders. By the time my son came home from work, he was exhausted and decided he would never return to Greenleaf Nursery again. Instead, my son was joining the Army. I was relieved to say the least, and excited Everett wouldn't be following this Bootwright person into the state penitentiary. Over the next 2 weeks, I spoke to my daughter in small bursts like, "It's hot outside," or "I'm hungry," or "There's nothing on TV." And she replied accordingly, which built up to longer bursts, even full sentences. By the time she went into labor, I was explaining to her what she might expect while giving birth, like they would only let her eat ice chips, no matter how thirsty. And she would hurt all the way from her lower back down into her legs, even with medication. Afterwards, she would want to sleep for days, which she did. And as I took care of my first grandchild, a grandson, who had my husband's bold eyes and my downward curving lips, in that moment, I was no longer disappointed in my daughter. Instead, I was proud. She did her best to find this tank person, calling all his friends to announce the arrival of his son, calling his house every night for 2 weeks straight. Tank conveniently never visited and allowed his parents to deal with my daughter, who told her that baby is not my grandchild. They requested a paternity test because, according to these people, my daughter probably didn't even know who the real father was. This talk ended when she did get a paternity test, and this tank person then had child support payments due every month. Served him right, and my daughter finally had her justice. On the day my son left for basic training, before an Army recruiter picked him up to take him to Oklahoma City, where he would get on a bus to Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri, he held his nephew. He said goodbye like he was going to the video store in Reese's to pick up a movie, and he would be back in 30 minutes. When we said goodbye, we knew he would be gone longer, but pretended like he'd be back soon. I write today as I have on every day. When I climbed into my car this afternoon and drove to Greenleaf Nursery, I thought about my son. When I kept driving down the highway and headed toward Vian, I thought about my daughter until I turned around and drove back to Tahlequah. As I sped down Stick Ross Mountain Road too fast, against bends too tight, near hills too close, with too many tears to miss one, I thought about their father. He'd died nearly 6 months ago, with only a shoulder shrug for a goodbye. I had not seen him in nearly 5 years, give or take. I myself had finally escaped his abuse, but not before he taught our children how to take the same. Today, I will return this copper pen with silver lettering to the video section in Reese's grocery store and place it back on the narrow shelf because I see clearly now that my husband was a pen that left this ink in these paper towels that no one will ever read. All right, I'll stop there. So yeah, Turtle Give Me Saddle. And yeah. Um, no, yeah. So that I wrote that particular chapter. It's an older chapter that I probably wrote. I want to say must have been 2012. Yeah, 2012, 2013. The earliest chapter in this book I wrote back in 2008, and that's um, Quentin Quitone's chapter in the book. It's my first, and it's a Kiowa centric. And then Hayes Shade is the second chapter, second oldest chapter, and um, and that one's Cherokee centric, Tahlequah centric. And Hayes Shade is loosely based off of a medicine man I used to go visit in Tahlequah, and he's kind of a combination of that particular medicine man, Toby Hughes. He used to have a shop called Cherokee in downtown Tahlequah back in the day, and a combination of him and Hastings Shade. So Hastings Shade was a vice principal chief at one point. He's was a cultural center. His family is a cultural center here in the community, and so his Hastings Shade's mom, Leanna Shade, that was the grandmother I lived with. So that's how we're connected. And but yeah, so that's very I wanted to read that story. One, I hadn't read it before out loud like that, so thank you for bearing with me. And a little bit emotional, but it's good. And very Tahlequah centric, very Oklahoma centric. Captures this community really well. And in light of this weekend and the celebrations that we're having right now, it kind of pays homage to our communities. So I'm not sure how much time we got. Okay, we got 15 more minutes. And usually I leave a little time for some Q&A. I do have another little section I want to read. It's Ever Gima Saddles chapter. I just want to read a few pages in it. Just because his circumstances, as he becomes an adult, he has kids, he adopts a kid, he's in Lawton, and then he moves back. By the end of the book, he moves back to Tahlequah. And so he finds himself in a very unique circumstance. And I had that same experience that he has in the book. So I want to read that. I'm going to read a little bit from there, and then I'll talk a little bit about what the connection is. I need to get a quick little drink, if that's all right, because I'm parched. Okay, so at this point, Ever Gima Saddle's in his early 30s. He has 3 biological kids and one adopted son. And so him and his 4 kids moved back to Tahlequah, living with his sister. His sister has 2 kids, so they're all in the same 3-bedroom house. And so you got 2 adults and you got 6 kids in the home, and it's kind of cramped. There is this. So when I first moved back to Tahlequah myself, I lived in Santa Fe, New Mexico or in northern New Mexico for about 10 years, and then I moved back. But there was this program, I guess, is where they had Cherokee Nation had repossessed homes. And in order to get one of those homes, then you had to come on this certain day and fill out this application, turn it in. But everybody had to arrive on that particular day. And so that's the situation Ever Gima Saddle is in. He was in Lawton. He moves back to Tahlequah. Oh, there's this situation. There's 50 homes. I'm cramped in the house with my sister and her kids. I need to get this home to keep my family intact. Um, and so he's gone to that particular. It's like a community building where everybody's supposed to do that. So what happens is that I guess some people will camp overnight. So they're like right at the front of the door, and so I did that whenever it happened to me. But I don't think they've done one since. So this must have been 2015, and but some of us camped out all night. There was like 20, 25 of us, and so that we'd be the first ones in the door, the first ones to fill out the paperwork. It's an interesting situation, but I'll let you experience a little bit of um, how that plays out for Evergema Saddle at this point. All right, so he's standing in line, and he meets a lady. Her name's Devetta, and so they just start talking about, where are you from, and that kind of thing. And so we're going to start off with Evergema Saddle, and he's going to be talking to her. I'm a stop, I told her, but my last name is Gimasaddle. I'm Kiowa and Cherokee. Oh wow, I married a stop, she said. She threw her head back and laughed, then added, I divorced him. You stop boys can't seem to keep your pants up when a pretty girl winks at you. I smiled and laughed awkwardly. I'm just playing with you, she said, and pushed my shoulder. I'm teasing. I knew, and she knew she wasn't teasing. But we chuckled as if we didn't know. It led to more talk. Good thing, too, because it was going to be a long night. Come to find out, the guy she divorced was one of my Cherokee primos. My mother's uncle Bradley had 10 sons and one daughter, those pre Nintendo numbers. Devetta was around my age, mid 30s, and was very talkative. She pulled out her smartphone, the newest Samsung, and swiped through pictures of her son. He was 10 years old and an avid baseball player. He had clear stop family features, characteristics I didn't have. Eyes a little more narrow and sharp cheekbones, like my grandmother and her brother. I took more after my mother, who took more after her Kiowa father, but more so her Kiowa great grandmother than him. I looked at the pictures on Daveda's phone and could see reflections of my family looking back. Funny how relations grew as old got older, more years, more kin. When Daveda and I stopped talking, we were surprised to find about 10 more newcomers on the sidewalk, lined up for the off chance to win a forever home. She said, Is this a hog fry before the stomp dance? And laughed at herself. I laughed too, although I hadn't been to a stomp since I was a teenager. Cherokees lined the sidewalk like a bucket of hog meat stood at the front door. A few newcomers took their place in line as more trickled in from the grew to 18 people. Someone in the crowd bellowed a loud turkey call just as the sun disappeared over the horizon. Powwow chairs in almost every color stretched from the front door down the sidewalk. People continued to drift in as darkness climbed over the duplexes. By 10:30, the line grew to 25 people, and all the voices between family, friends, and spouses carried into the night and filled the air from Ross Swimmer over to Muskogee Avenue. At the first sign of heavy cloud, someone said, Weather's supposed to get a little rough tonight. We kept our eyes trained on the sky, waiting. The storm hit the trees first. Under gusts of wind, leaves clamored and branches tossed. Next, we felt trickles of water on our cheeks and shoulders. The distant lightning flashed behind heavy clouds and gave us a quick moment to see what was heading in our direction. Then the sky shapes behind our eyelids. The sprinkles turned into drops, cringing. A voice in the group called out, Let's make a pattern under the porch. Past 11 o'clock, and everyone was already on top of each other. It was going to be a long night. As uncomfortable as we were, with just inches of space between bodies, it was better than cold rain on our backs. The drops quickly turned into a heavy downpour. I huddled closer to Devetta as she extended a blanket toward me, and I pulled out the quilt Mom had given me. I looked over the bird patterns and thought about my grandmother, Lena. remembering, when did she make this quilt? It looked old. Then I noticed my name embroidered in one of the corners of the quilt. Ever. It was mine. There was so much I needed to ask my mother, but I was distracted by the cold rain falling just outside the porch. Davetta and I sat next to the wall, but the splash of when we envied turtles as we huddled underneath the porch as if it were a shell. The lightning came in as heavy and as fast as the rain. The first shot of thunder rolled from a few miles away. People in the crowd counted. Then the thunder slammed in unison with the lightning above us. We flinched and then cringed. Each flash blinded us, and each clap of thunder made us move a little closer together. A loud crack whipped through the air, and behind the flash, there was an explosion. Sparks shot out from a transformer on a pole near Muskogee Avenue. We yelled out in surprise, and a vibration moved through us, as though a current of electricity tied us all together. It was our fear. We came to our feet and peered past the trees and buildings, trying to see if the transformer had fallen. Then all the lights in the neighborhood turned off. A deeper darkness covered us, and we all went silent, listening. We only heard rain and wind cutting through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, sirens and horns blared in response to the shattered transformer. The storm was Uhanala, and we all knew it wouldn't stop soon. A tall lady from the hawk shooter family yelled, "I called someone and they're bringing us tarps." She stood next to her brother, who was the same height. We said back, "Wado and Oost." And then we sat back down into our chairs, huddling inside blankets and against each other. The mother to the hawk shooter siblings drove into the parking lot less than 10 minutes later on a break from Hastings Hospital and delivered us 6 tarps. She had the same strong jawline and towering height as her kids. We all came to our feet. The son went to his truck and came back with a thick roll of duct tape. Together we were together we unrolled the tarps under the rain and against the wind. The lightning and thunder had moved onto a different part of Oklahoma. We spread the tarp wide and long between the posts. We used the duct tape to fasten one side to the pole, and we used the screwdrivers to root the tarp into the ground. While most of them were big enough to spread from ground to ceiling, one tarp was too small. The brother hawk shooter stood from his powwow chair like a giant rising from the forest, with rain still gushing, and held a tarp to the top of the porch. His sister quickly grabbed the opposite end. We grabbed the other corners. We had prayed under our breaths to shift us all into a single unified turtle and couldn't help but smile at what we had become. We stayed fixed in that position for what felt like hours, with the muscles in our arms and legs hurting with exhaustion. The heavy rains became lighter, and the winds let the rain fall straight down. Soon we were able to release the tarp on the north side, giving our bodies a moment to recover. As the rugged part of the storm faded, the chatter picked up. Someone yelled, "If this was a stomp dance, then at least we'd have a fire to warm us." Another voice called out, "Why do we still hold stomps at night?" "That's the only time we can be real Cherokees," a voice answered from the crowd. Then someone added, "Under the cover of darkness." We all remembered how practicing anything Cherokee had once been a crime and a reason to be killed. When our customs fell out of favor, it was best to keep them alive inside the earth, like a medicine root waiting to be harvested at the coldest point in winter. It was a fishing hawk family member who said, "My sister is bringing us a pot of grape dumplings." And then a no fire offered, "We have a bowl of fried bread on our table." And a marble said, "I'll get my family to bring coffee." Trucks, SUVs, and minivans pulled into the parking lot, dropping off food, and then drove away, leaving us stocked up for the night. We repositioned ourselves to the left and right of the porch and placed the food and drink in the center. We spooned the grape dumplings into styrofoam cups. We held a piece of fried bread between 2 fingers and a cup of coffee in the other. We squeezed by and stepped around each other. Someone teased, "Tomorrow you're going to have purple lips." And another responded, "From the dumplings or the cold?" We laughed between bites, and soon we chatted about how and why we were so desperate to have one of the 50 repossessed homes. I'm going to go ahead and stop there. So, one of the things that I liked about that particular evening because I personally experienced it. It happened just like that, I just described it there. And was there was an instant sense of community. The moment that the rain came in, and we got stormed on really bad that night. We all huddled underneath the porch. It was like a long porch, and we held up these tarps, and it was like storming on us, and then we all started to bring in food. Like we started making calls, like, "Can you bring this? Can you bring that?" So everybody brought us something, and we just kind of camped out underneath that porch, and just sat there and talked, and just ate and drank coffee and hung out. But it was a strong sense of community instantly formed with that group of 20, 25 people that were there. Um, and then I'll save the like the rest of the book, the rest of that particular the end of the book takes an interesting twist, interesting turn. Um, so I'll not talk about that so that you can experience it whenever you read, if you haven't read it yet. Um, but just getting that sense of community was super important. I thought it spoke really well to what we're doing here this weekend for Cherokee National Holiday, and that we're here to support each other. Cherokees and natives from all over the place by the thousands coming here to Tahlequah, um, and so to celebrate and just different practices, different customs, whether it's the powwow or if it's more traditional stuff like stickball and things like that inside the community. But just here to support each other and be around each other, and to have that camaraderie and know that there are other Cherokees who have similar experiences to us that are here. And so I wanted to end on that note. Um, so, but yeah, thank you very much. And I guess I have a few minutes if anybody has any questions at all. Um, I did not get a house. I'm not going to tell you what happens to ever. I did not get a house. So I did. We camped out all night, and the interesting thing that happens is that it's not a line. Like that was my perception. Is that when they opened up the doors, everybody was in a single line, and one at a time you handed it in. It was like a madhouse. And by that morning, when we were like sleeping and we woke up, there was probably like 50 more people because they all came in like at 6, 7 o'clock in the morning. And so then they all rush everybody into the building. It's probably like at least 100 bodies in a room that probably about this size. And so everybody's desperate too. Everybody's in the same situation. I got to get a house. I got to take care of my kids. And so everybody's like couldn't a mad dash to the front counter, which I depict you'll see that in the book as well. Um, but yeah, no, I didn't get a house, but yeah, that was Spanish, and that's another dynamic with the book. Is I do a kind of a trilingual thing where really there are certain chapters that are Cherokee centric, and I'll use Cherokee and English mix in those particular chapters, and Kiowa centric stories where it's Kiowa and English mix. Um, and then there are ever where kind of like myself, where I'm primarily raised in Cherokee and Kiowa communities. One of his cousins comes in on one of the chapters, and she does the English and Spanish mix. And so by the time we get to Ever's chapter, we get a strong sense of all the influences, you know, that have come to him. And so he mixes all of it. So he's Kiowa Cherokee. I think that is one of the more interesting qualities of the book. And that's, those multilingual, the multicultural, multilingual aspects is probably why the book has gotten as much attention as it has. Um, but like they had mentioned before, it won the 2023 Penn Hemingway Award, which is pretty cool. Any other questions? Yeah. Mm. Oh my goodness. Hmm. Oh my goodness. It was like, um, I think it's like it's new, like it's like like I'm excited for all this stuff coming in. A lot of like you said, anxiety with it, which was interesting. I did not expect that to have so much like worry, about it, and but you just get inundated. Like at first it was just like, oh, it's on this list, and it's just the best of the summer list, and then it's on, like they're considering for this award and they're considering for that award, and it just being grateful for that to happen, especially as it took me 15 years, to get to that point. You just like a tremendous amount of gratitude that I finally, I got to this point. Um, But yeah, the anxiety part of it, I did not anticipate having as much anxiety. I did. I started smoking, but you know, I'm trying to quit now. But oh, number two, yeah. Then I definitely wanted to talk about that. Thank you for asking me that. I think a lot of people, especially on my social media, so I am like on Twitter and Instagram, Facebook. Twitter and Facebook are probably the ones that are more robust. Book two, I and it's a it uses the theme and the structure of that traditional story into a modern narrative, and so the so this of her vision. So I gave it to my editor, and she said she wanted certain things changed in it, and so I ended up taking 3 chapters out. So this is like 3 or 4 months ago. I take 3 chapters out. I've since in the last 3 months added 3 more chapters back into the book to kind of like my agent and my editor are real nice, and they're like, well, maybe we should focus on this character a little bit. This character is interesting, you know. And I'm like, but it's about this, and and so I get mad, and then I pout for like a month, and then I'm okay, all right, you're right, you know, I'll change it, and then I'll go in and pull it out, and then add the new stuff in, and I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I still have those kind of responses. Hopefully by book 3 I get used to it. Um, and so right now, like I've added the 3 chapters, and I'm going back through and I'm polishing. So I'm polishing the totality of the book itself, and to a point where I'm ready for the editor to take a look at it again and see if there's other things she might want to tweak. So we're kind of in that back and forth phase. I'm not sure how long that'll go. Maybe 6, 9 months, something like that, and then we'll have something more like set in stone. Like, okay, it'll release in at this date, that time. But yeah, so I guess I would be like on the tail end of polishing phases, and I would imagine that it might not come out until 2025. Just because whenever I finished this book, when they set the date for it to release, it was a year out. So, and I would imagine it'll be the same kind of, it'll be a year out whenever we finish it all up. Cool, thank you. Any other questions? Yeah, yeah. Mhm. Whenever she was younger, she could speak Kiowa pretty well. Like she was, so my mother was born in 1950, and so her great grandmother only spoke Kiowa, and so she, as a little girl, because in Kiowa community, great grandmother's a big sister. So like your big sister's your big sister, but then when you get older, it kind of comes back around again to being a big sister again. And so she was in charge of taking care of her. So that was her big sister. So we call the term is op-e, and so she would translate for her. So she understood Kiowa clearly, even though she only spoke a little, but she understood um, her great grandmother really well, and so she would care for her and then translate for the family what she was saying. And similarly with Spanish, she did the same thing. So my dad's from Mexico and spoke very little English, I mean broken English, and but she got to a point where she could understand him. She could understand what he was saying, and she could translate. Even though she wasn't really, I don't know if I ever heard my mother speak any Spanish at all, but she could understand what he was saying and then translate it. So I'm wondering if that, I think just her mind is kind of like that, um, and so she's super intelligent, like a very intelligent lady, and you wouldn't know. I mean, because she's so quiet, you wouldn't really understand how intelligent she is until you can see her like around math. Like math, she can do like huge numbers, math figures in her head. Like she doesn't have to write anything down. You can ask her like, "What's this plus that or times that," and she'll just say it. So she's super intelligent in that way. And so like beating and sewing, so a lot of that makes sense because it's a lot of counting, and she likes that kind of thing. So cool. Any any other questions, curiosities? Or okay, yeah, yeah. Okay, yeah. So the cover, um, it comes directly from Gort dance culture. So the artist, her name is Kristen Apodaca, and she's out of El Paso, Texas. And so Algonquin books, they had known about her. They know, I guess they know different. The design um, director knows different artists around the country, and um, and whenever they read my book, they thought, okay, this artist, she does like a kind of an abstract style of art, um, and thought it was a good fit for the way that this novel is structured in a kind of an abstract way, and so she just read the book and they came up with this image of the main character. And so it's the dollar bill, so the crumpled dollar bill. And if you've gone to Gord dances, I might try to go to the Gord dance today. I don't know how hot it's gonna get. It's kind of hot out there, but when we're at the Gord dances and we're dancing, and when we honor somebody, we'll crumple a dollar or just drop a dollar bill in front of them, stand next to them, and dance. And so that's what that crumpled dollar bill is. It's a crumpled dollar bill that's saying so when we're trying to honor someone, so in his mind, he's trying to live with honor, in a lot of different ways. He's trying to overcome, the obstacles in his life to live with honor. And the red and blue sash is a part of Gort dance culture. That's the sash we wear. And so the red that's on the front and the blue and the black means that he's Kiowa. So if it was blue on the front and red in the back, it would signify he's Comanche. So those are some of the nuances with it. Cool. Thank you for that question. All right. I think that we are past time. Thank you very much. I'm very grateful.